Hello, my friends. As we watch the endless talk about finding a path to peace in the Russia-Ukraine war, you'd think we were dealing with serious people carefully weighing serious options. We're not. The entire discussion in the West is trapped inside a media bubble and a political echo chamber that refuses to confront the basic reality. Ukraine will never get the security guarantees it is being promised, and the people pushing this illusion know it. They simply don't care, because the costs are not paid in Paris, Berlin, London, or Washington. They're paid in Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Odessa, in Ukrainian lives, on Ukrainian soil, in a war that serves Western geopolitical fantasies and corporate balance sheets far more than it serves the people of Ukraine. If you strip away the fog of propaganda, what you see is this: Russia has clear, limited, achievable objectives, backed by a coherent strategy and a robust industrial and financial base. The West has maximalist rhetoric, shrinking stockpiles, hollowed-out economies, and no plausible pathway to the victory it keeps promising. That's not an ideological judgment. It's a balance of forces reality. Start with Europe. You hear constant talk from European leaders about standing with Ukraine as long as it takes. But look at who is actually driving this. Not Europe in some unified sense, but a core group: Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and a few especially zealous Eastern Europeans. Even within the EU and NATO, there is no real consensus on what to do next. Some countries openly oppose escalation. Others want to go all in. This is not a bloc moving with clarity toward a defined strategic end state. It's a divided collection of states clinging to the status quo because nobody wants to be the first to admit they backed a losing strategy. The absurdity becomes obvious when you look at the numbers. Germany, France, and the UK together have about 220 million people. Their combined ground forces are under 500,000. Ukraine, once you strip away the fantasies and propaganda, has a real population of maybe 19 million left under Kyiv's control when you account for refugees and lost territories. Yet these same European states insist that Ukraine should sustain and expand a ground army in the range of 800,000 or more. In other words, they want a country with about 1/10 their population to field a land army larger than the combined armies of Germany, France, and Britain. That is not a strategy. That is madness. Before the war, Ukraine maintained roughly 250,000 active personnel for several years, a steady state force sized to what its economy and tax base could support. When the conflict escalated in 2022, they mobilized reserves, perhaps 700,000 to 900,000 on paper. At the peak, you could argue they had about 1 million people in uniform. That's what full mobilization looks like for a state already struggling economically. The country is now physically shattered, its economy gutted, its demographics in free fall, and we're supposed to pretend it can sustain or even grow that force while fighting a long war against a much larger, economically healthier opponent? The only way that works is if the West pays the bills indefinitely. And the West is in no condition to do that. Look at the economic fundamentals. The country with the lowest debt to GDP ratio among major industrial states is not the United States, not Germany, not France, not the UK. It's Russia. By contrast, key European states, especially France and the UK, are at or above 100% debt to GDP. In simple terms, they're already spending more than they bring in. Germany, which for years strutted around as the paragon of fiscal prudence, has now passed new laws to go deeper into debt to rebuild its military. That's not a sign of strength. It's the blackjack table strategy. I've already lost $100,000. Let me borrow another $100,000 so I can gamble my way out of this hole. The casino loves that logic. Reality does not. Add to this the suicidal energy policy. Europe decided, in its infinite wisdom, that it no longer wanted reliable, cheap Russian oil and gas. Instead, it chose to pay some of the highest prices in the world for alternative supplies, just as its economies were slowing and entering structural crisis. This wasn't done from a position of strength. It was done from a mixture of ideological rage toward Russia and blind obedience to Washington's line, even at the expense of European industry. Meanwhile, what's happening in Russia? The Western narrative insists that sanctions have finally brought the Russian economy to the brink. We've been hearing variations of that line since 2014. Every time the sanctions fail, the answer from Western elites is, we just need one more round. The next sanctions package will do it. But they never explain how. They don't map out which sectors will be crippled, how that will cascade through the economy, why this round will succeed where the last 19 failed. There's no economic logic, just magical thinking. Russia, facing those sanctions, did something the West finds deeply threatening. It adapted. It reoriented trade, developed domestic substitutes, deepened ties with non-Western partners, and used state policy to manage inflation and wage growth. While Western commentators were shouting, "Russia is imploding," ordinary Russians saw something very different. Wages rising faster than inflation, stores stocked, restaurants open, basic goods available, unemployment essentially at zero for anyone who wants to work. This does not mean Russia is a utopia. It means it is not collapsing, and anyone claiming otherwise is either ignorant or lying. The reason Russians are so determined not to bend to Western pressure is simple. They remember what real collapse looks like. In the 1,990 seconds after the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia experienced genuine economic catastrophe. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Professionals and factory workers went unpaid for months at a time. Crime exploded. Life expectancy for men dropped from the low 60 seconds into the mid 50 seconds. Millions of excess deaths piled up above what you'd expect in normal times. People walked past dead bodies in major cities. Trash wasn't collected. Women sold their bodies just to feed their families. It was a period so traumatic that calling it a whole would be an insult to wholes. The West had its chance then to show that its model could bring prosperity to Russia. Instead, it presided over an era of looting and humiliation. Russians remember that. They've lived through economic collapse and survived. They will not be terrorized by the idea of losing access to French handbags or German car parts. Today's Russian economy is more diversified, less dependent on Western imports, anchored by immense natural resources and supported by a population that has already paid the price once and will not willingly go back. That's why the sanctions strategy is failing and why the West's insistence on doubling down is so dangerous. What makes this more obscene is that while Western leaders claim to be standing up for democracy and human rights, they show almost no concern for the Ukrainian people themselves. Look at the pattern. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Serbia, Vietnam, Panama, Somalia. The list goes on. When the United States and its allies intervene in other countries, they speak the language of freedom and humanitarianism, but the populations of those countries are treated as expendable pieces on a geopolitical chessboard. The people who die, the cities that are destroyed, the societies that are shattered, those costs are never really reckoned with. In Ukraine, we're seeing the same script. Western politicians and media glorify Ukrainian bravery, call Ukraine the front line of democracy, say these people are dying for our way of life. They wrap Ukrainian sacrifice in noble language precisely so they can justify demanding more sacrifice. When the conflict eventually moves off the front page and the political class shifts its attention elsewhere, the dead and maimed will still be there. The destroyed infrastructure will still be there, but the West will move on, just as it did after Iraq and Afghanistan. Underneath all this moral posturing is something much more banal: money. This war is a business model. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and others are making record profits. Their shareholders are doing just fine. Every new aid package to Ukraine is also a subsidy to Western defense contractors. That doesn't mean conspirators sit in a secret room cackling about dead Ukrainians. It means the structural incentives of the system push toward more conflict, more tension, more arms production, and they push against serious diplomacy. Russia sees this clearly. So do many countries in the global south. That brings us to Sergei Lavrov's remarks. Western media treat his statements as propaganda or bluster. They shouldn't. Lavrov is articulating a view deeply rooted in Russian history and in a clear-eyed reading of current power balances. When he says Europe is blinded by a desire to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia and cannot imagine recognizing that Russia has achieved its lawful objectives, he is not being jingoistic. He's describing the ideological trap Western leaders have built for themselves. For 2 centuries, Russia's main security threat has come from the West. Napoleon's invasion in 1812, the British-French aggression in Crimea in the 1850 seconds, the Allied intervention during the Russian Civil War, Hitler's Operation Barbarossa in 1941. In each case, the drive came from Western capitals, not Moscow. The 2 times Russia truly moved west, in a big way, marching into Paris in 1814 as part of a broad coalition against Napoleon and occupying Eastern Europe after World War II, were direct responses to catastrophic invasions from the West that killed millions of Russians. The post-1945 Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was not simply some cartoonish communist plot for world conquest. It was a hard, cold demand for a buffer zone after losing roughly 27 million people in what Russians call the Great Patriotic War. That trauma is still alive. Almost every Russian family has a story of a grandfather who died at the front, a grandmother who endured siege conditions, relatives lost to starvation, bombing, or occupation. They mark Victory Day not as nostalgic theater, but as a living memory of near annihilation. When Russians hear NATO countries talking again about marching east, about deterring Russia at its borders, about arming hostile regimes on their doorstep, they don't react the way a comfortable American TV pundit reacts. They hear echoes of 1,812 and 1,941. They are not wrong to be wary. Now compare the tone and posture on the 2 sides today. From the Russian leadership, Putin, Peskov, Lavrov, you hear consistency. Their demands and red lines have changed little since before February 2022. They want recognition of Crimea and the new regions as Russian, an end to NATO expansion into Ukraine, and a demilitarized, neutral Ukraine that cannot be used as a launch pad against them. They say so openly. They project confidence, but it is the confidence of someone who knows he has the industrial capacity, manpower, and logistics to sustain the current course and, if necessary, go further. From the Western side, you also hear confidence sometimes bordering on arrogance, Macron talking about still having cards to play, Starmer boasting about Britain's role, various officials insisting Russia is on the verge of collapse. But the material base behind that rhetoric is crumbling. Look at British defense assessments that admit in their own media that the UK could only fight a high-intensity war for a couple of weeks before running out of ammunition and parts. Look at the pitiful state of the Royal Navy's nuclear submarine force, struggling to keep a few boats operational and literally advertising for someone competent enough to command the fleet. Look at Germany's threadbare armored forces and its desperate attempt to rebuild a serious military while its industrial base is weakening and energy costs are soaring. Meanwhile, Russia has ramped up production of artillery shells, tanks, aircraft, missiles, and drones across the board. It has increased ground forces, expanded training pipelines, and built up stockpiles not just to fight Ukraine, but with an eye toward the possibility of direct confrontation with NATO. Putin could stand up recently and say that Russia will reduce military spending next year, not because the war is over, but because the surge of capacity they needed has already been created and can now be sustained at a lower marginal cost. They never fully mobilized their economy. They didn't have to. They had slack planning and resources. Western commentators like to believe they can replicate that if only they get serious. They can't. They lack not only the political will, but the physical industrial base and, crucially, the raw materials. The United States and Europe have offshored large segments of their manufacturing to places like China and Mexico. Steel mills, heavy industry, component production, much of it is gone or hollowed out. You can't conjure up a trained industrial workforce in modern factories overnight. Even if you somehow talk China into exporting the critical minerals and parts necessary to fuel a full Western rearmament, an absurd scenario. Given China's partnership with Russia, you would still need years to build capacity, and all of those new factories would be legitimate military targets in any serious conflict. During World War II, the United States could flip civilian assembly lines at Ford or GM and turn them into tank and aircraft production in months. The infrastructure was already there. The workers were already there. Today, we have turned ourselves into service economies and financial casinos. We're very good at moving money around and producing PowerPoint slides. We are not good at mass producing artillery shells. In a long war of attrition, that matters more than slogans. You see the same pattern in personnel. In 1969, at the height of the Vietnam War, the United States had roughly 543,000 troops in Vietnam, with more stationed in Europe, Korea, and elsewhere, backed by a larger total army. Today, the entire U.S. Army is about 470,000, smaller than just the Vietnam contingent then, and much of the reserve component is exhausted after 2 decades of rotational deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. The idea that the United States and NATO could simultaneously sustain Ukraine at current or higher levels, prepare for a direct confrontation with Russia, and hold forces in reserve for Iran, China, or Venezuela is fantasy. Russia understands this. Western leaders pretend not to. That gap between rhetoric and reality is where wars are lost. All of this leads to a simple conclusion. Russia has earned the right, through performance and resources, to be confident about its position. The West has not. And that has concrete implications for any future peace. Russia's terms are not secret. They are straightforward. Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson must be recognized internationally as part of the Russian Federation. NATO must abandon any integration of Ukraine and remove its military infrastructure from Ukrainian territory. Ukraine must hold genuine elections to replace the current clique of ultranationalists and Bandera admirers in Kyiv with a government that can actually implement a settlement. These are not bargaining chips for Russia. They are the minimum. If Kyiv and its Western backers refuse, Russia will simply continue the war, not out of emotional spite, but because it can. It has the men, the factories, the ammunition, the energy, the financial stability, and the political will. Ukraine does not. If this continues, Russia will not stop at the current front line. It will push to the Dnieper, consolidate control over all of Zaporizhia, take Dnipropetrovsk, Poltava, Sumy, Kharkiv, and then move south and west toward Mykolaiv and Odessa. It will close Ukraine's remaining access to the Black Sea, enforcing a de facto and then de jure blockade. There are already signs of this trend in strikes on Ukrainian shipping and port infrastructure. Once Odessa is gone, Ukraine becomes a landlocked, amputated remnant, heavily dependent on neighbors who are themselves in economic distress. And those same neighbors, the Europeans Zelensky listens to so faithfully, are the ones who cannot credibly guarantee anything because they are financially overextended and militarily underprepared. Imagine 2 men offering to sponsor your fight. One is Elon Musk, enormous resources, demonstrated capacity, whatever you think of him personally. The other is a man who just walked out of bankruptcy court, deeply in debt, with no clear income. If the bankrupt man says, "Don't worry, I've got your back, go all in," you'd be a fool to believe him. Yet that's exactly what Zelensky is doing, ignoring the state of Western economies and militaries and betting his country's future on the promises of leaders who can't back up their words. Meanwhile, when Donald Trump says Ukraine needs elections and needs to accept territorial losses to end the war, Kyiv responds with defiance. No land will ever be ceded, elections only under an unconditional Russian ceasefire, and so forth. This isn't a negotiating strategy. It's self-destruction. It's Baghdad Bob insisting American tanks are nowhere near the city as you watch them on live TV rolling through the streets. Reality will not bend to these illusions. The West also clings to the belief that it can shock Russia by escalating, allowing Ukraine to hit deep into Russian territory with Western missiles, or by dreaming up some asymmetric strike that will suddenly bring Moscow to its knees. Look at Russia's own record. After more than 3 years of high-intensity conflict, it has launched thousands of missiles, dropped vast numbers of glide bombs, used swarms of drones, and still has not compelled Ukraine to surrender. Ukraine, with a fraction of Russia's industrial base, is supposed to match or exceed that level of strike intensity in a matter of months and thereby break Russia's will. It is absurd. If Russia has not been able to bomb Ukraine into surrender in 42 months, Ukraine will not bomb Russia into surrender in 2. What air power alone failed to do in Germany, Korea, and Vietnam, it will not suddenly do in nuclear-armed Russia. The cold reality is that Russia is willing and able to continue this war until its objectives are met. It is not desperate for a ceasefire. It is not running out of ammunition, men, or money. It is not collapsing under sanctions. It has a memory of historical invasions that shapes its worldview and a population that understands what is at stake. The West, by contrast, is overextended, deindustrialized, fragmented, and addicted to a fantasy of cost-free hegemony. It has turned Ukraine into a sacrificial pawn in a game it cannot win on the terms it has set. If you genuinely care about the people of Ukraine, not as symbols, not as props and speeches, but as human beings, the only morally and strategically coherent position is this: stop lying to them. Stop telling them they can reconquer Crimea and Donetsk. Stop pretending NATO will march to the Dnieper to save them. Stop promising security guarantees you cannot enforce. Accept that Russia has already won, in the sense that it cannot be defeated militarily or economically by the tools the West is willing and able to use. The only question left is how much more of Ukraine will be destroyed before that truth is acknowledged. Russia has made its peace offer clear. It wants a stable, neutral Ukraine that cannot be weaponized against it, and international recognition of the territorial realities created by this war. If those terms are rejected now, they will not get softer later, they will get harsher. Every month of delay moves the line of contact further west, not east. History will not be kind to the politicians who, out of pride and delusion, pushed Ukraine to fight to the last Ukrainian for objectives that were never attainable. Nor will it be kind to the Western publics who allowed themselves to be lulled by slogans while their own economies declined and a multipolar world emerged without them. Russia has done what any serious state does when it is threatened. It prepared, it adapted, it fought on terms that suited its strengths. The West, high on its own propaganda, has forgotten how to do that. In this confrontation, confidence is not a mood. It is a function of reality. And on the ground, in factories, in artillery parks, on balance sheets, in manpower reserves, reality is on Russia's side.